Hey, what is going on everyone? Mekkah here and welcome to another Fire Emblem Archetype tier list. I'm getting back into these tier lists and what we're having next here is the Berserker, Pirates, Bandit tier list. So here I'm tiering basically every X fighter that I can find that I didn't tier on my X fighter brawler kind of tier list. So we're looking at Bandits, Pirates, Berserkers, that kind of units today. And the first thing we need to say about those is they are almost always, without exception, super fun to use because they tend to have three things in spades. HP, so they got a lot of bulk, strength, so they do a lot of damage, and then crits, so they crit for a lot of damage. And one of the most satisfying things in Fire Emblem is, of course, doing overkill massive damage to an enemy, crushing them in one hit with about 50 damage to spare. There's hardly a better feeling in Fire Emblem, I think, overall. That makes them so fun to use. Sometimes they also have a lot of speed to go with it, and they have some good offense, and sometimes they're not as lucky and they're kind of slow, unfortunately. The other thing they tend to be kind of lacking in is, well, they walk on water, so they have like the mobility down in that regard. But on the other hand, they are never mounted, so they have some issues with that. Accuracy can be a problem because axes in some games have awful hit rates, and of course they are up the creek without a paddle when they're up against a sword user. In a game where Rubber Triangle is concerned. Especially range attacks can be troublesome if the hand axe is bad accuracy. And there's one more thing I wanted to say about them that I forgot. Oh yeah, they tend to have really high constitution, so sometimes rescuing them can be a bit troublesome. But that's generalizations. Let's go into them case by case. And I got a couple cases for you today. Darrows is represented in 3 games total. He's an FE1, he's an FE11 Shadow Dragon, and a new mystery, of course. And the weird thing about Darrows is they cut him out from Mystery of the Emblem, FE3. He's not in Book 2 and he's not in Book 1. So, unfortunately, no becoming sale there. Dice is from New Mystery, if you didn't recognize him. He's actually a fighter that just promotes to Warrior, but since he has a Viking helmet and he can reclass to Berserker just as easily, I thought I might as well include him. Because I don't think I put him on the other tier list, as far as I remember. I think I might have forgotten him. Let me just double check, though, to see if that's the case. Yeah, so I literally forgot to put him on that list, so I'm just gonna discuss him here. Marty and Dagdar are from FE5, Thracia 776. We have Gonzalez, Geese, and Garrett, the 3 Gs from the Binding Blade. Dart and Hawkeye, who I somehow almost forgot from Blazing Blade, FE7. And FE8 has, of course, Dazla as the only Berserker. Ross isn't here because I already discussed him in the fighter video along with Garcia, and I thought he'd rather be with his dad than be with this weird guy. We have Largo from FE9, Path of Radiance, and these are from a fan hack called The Last Promise, which is a super fun hack based on FE7 but completely new and original. And it actually has two, it has a pirate and a berserker that you can recruit. And I thought it might be fun to include these since I don't have that many berserkers to discuss today. So, as a general rule, these units are not super great for efficient play, with some exceptions, so don't expect too many of the in the S tier. But on the other hand, almost none of them are that terrible to belong in like the lower regions. It tends to be a bit of a middle of the pack where they can be super helpful for casual players looking for some good combat or something fun to use at the very least. Nothing super efficient, but nothing absolutely terrible either, as far as I remember, with some exceptions, of course. But yeah, let's get into it case by case, right? So. Darrows in FE1. I actually tried really hard to use him in my only playthrough of FE1 because I thought it was super funny. The sad thing about axe users in FE1 is they cannot promote at all. There are no ways to promote them. Same goes for Barst and Friends. So that is unfortunate. Water walking is still kind of fun. Marth can do it too, so it's not like super exclusive, but it's just something funny you can do. One thing I've noticed in FE1 is the axe stat distribution is kind of weird. There's like a hammer that you can use that has 1 less weight and 1 less might than the Iron Axe. It's actually kind of a good weapon because there are a lot of armored enemies. Of course, hitting can be a bit of an issue with it, but overall it kind of worked for me when I was using Darrows. There was a point in FE1 where I was using him like full time, trying really hard to use him. But at some point, I just got bored with FE1, and I was like, alright, let's just soup up Marth and Jagan and Minerva with stat boosters and just crush this whole game, because I'm just so done with it. It's so slow and so tedious to play, and Darrows, like, using Darrows does really help with that. Like, even just moving units in FE1 is so annoying and so tedious that using Darrows felt like it was weighing me down. This isn't just his fault, it goes for, like, actually competent units too, like Ogma, for example, Navarre. Those are good units too, but it just didn't really feel like moving 8 of those in a turn because the game's UI is so prehistoric. I do remember Darrows being sort of helpful in the early game. But as the game goes along, there's no real reason to just keep using him, especially because he cannot promote. He has low mobility overall, and there isn't really much of a niche for water walking or using axes in general. There's no weapon triangle, and the hammer is like the only kind of axe utility you have. FE1 doesn't even have anything like the hot glare, for example, that FE11 gives you as a reward for getting A rank axes. So yeah, I think overall this Darrows is like D tier. I don't think he's just so terrible to belong in E tier. I think that's reserved for someone like, I don't know, Tomas, Dolph, McAllen, units like that. I think he's better than those because at the very least he can do something in the early game, and I mean he's got some entertainment value there. It's not the most serious of tier list. Let's just keep that in mind. Shadow Dragon, of course, it's the same environment but very different because now there's a weapon triangle. Units can reclass to other classes. You got more weapons to choose from. You have better axes to choose from. You can promote Darrows, which is also a pretty big deal. You can reclass to other classes. Of course, when you have reclassing the mix, it also removes pretty much anything that's unique about the water walking, because now anyone can become a pirate. Like if you want a pirate slash berserker Darrows, sure, but you'd rather have a pirate berserker Barst instead. So that kind of exclusivity is gone, and then Darrows is just left with his base stats once reclassing becomes available in Chapter 4, and those aren't that good. Darrows, I think, is the slowest unit in FE11 overall. He has absolutely awful speed. I think his speed grows like 10%. I think if you reclass him to Knight, it actually becomes 0%. He has just no chance of leveling up speed. I did actually use Armor Knight General Darrows in my last Iron Man run of Shadow Dragon, and he actually survived all the way up to 24x. It was actually pretty useful in like the Ballista chapter, for example. It was stupidly funny how good he could be. I also remember forging a really big forged hammer. I spent like all my gold on it in chapter 6 so he could Oko. I think it was like the can opener. I think that's what we call it. He was actually not terrible. Not good either, like don't get me wrong. He's not a good unit. It's required too much resources to make it worth, and there was obviously better axe uses available. But like having a D rank in axes in Shadow Dragon is not terrible. Put you in a spot where you're close-ish to using the hammer come chapter 6. Let's use a hand axe, unlike someone like Cord who joins with E rank axes, or if you reclass someone like Ogma to pirate, they end up much worse. So I think he's like at least better than his FE1 Incarnate by a fair bit. Like in a vacuum, he's much better than his FE1 Incarnate just because he can promote and stuff, but because everyone else gets so much better as well, I think he still ends up roughly in the same spot. FE12 Darrows is a very different beast. In that game, he's actually a pre-promote, a Berserker that joins about halfway through the game in the Henri's Way arc, the part where Marth is tracing the path of Henri to get to Goto. Get spheres and stuff, you know, collect the magic MacGuffins, and so he just joins you in the graveyard, the Fire Dragon graveyard, and he's not half bad. He has pretty good HP, strength, and I believe speed bases as well, like absolute. He joins as a Berserker, but you can reclass him to something else if you want to. Like if you wanted the Draco Knight Darrows, you can have one, because class sets in FE12 can be merged, the male one specifically, so he has access to General, Berserker, Wyvern, like quite a few good classes. Like if you wanted the Horseman Darrows, you can have him, for example, but the main reason to use Darrows in that game, I think, is the Axe rank. I believe he joins with, it's either A or B, I forgot exactly which, but the point is that his rank is really good, and he can do some nice work in it. So I think I'm actually going to put him like in C tier. I don't think he's a great promote. It's hard to really stand out in FE12 because in the lower difficulties, like Hard 1, the enemies just kind of fall over and die a lot of the time, especially in normal mode. Hard 1 is like slightly more difficult, and then Hard 2, Hard 3, enemies are so strong that everyone kind of has trouble keeping up. Darrows works alright though. He's not going to stand out and destroy like everything on enemy phase, but he works out quite well. He can get done whatever you want to get done. It's hard to be really specific about what he can do because FE12 is one of those games where I'm not super experienced with the higher level difficulty play, but I have seen what he can do in like 0% growth, for example, and it was pretty good. I wouldn't say it was amazing. You wouldn't, as he's not like Pala or something. It's not like you get a second Pala, but maybe roughly on par with people like Leiden and Bell, for example. Like roughly that spot is what I would think of when I'm thinking Darrows. Then there's Dice. He does join unpromoted, but he's at level 10 when he joins, I think, or level 12. So you can just instantly promote him and have another pre-promote. His bases are a little worse than Darrows, and I don't think he does a whole lot in the chapters he's around before Darrows joins. So basically he's there for like 10x, and then 11, and then I guess 12, 13. I forgot exactly when Darrows joins number-wise, but it's roughly around that spot. I think he's overall a bit worse than Darrows. Like I said, he's a fighter at base, but he has an axe rank, and you can just reclass him to Berserker if you want to, and he has a Viking helmet. Like, how can we not put him on this tier list, theme-wise? But I haven't really had a whole lot of experience with dice. There was one time when we were doing an FE12 draft race where I was thinking of picking dice at some point to help with one specific boss kill. There's like a chapter with an island in the middle where you gotta walk over it and get there to kill the boss. And I think we were allowing units to be warped as long as they were not Marth. And he was one of the few units who could actually one-round that boss at base with like a hammer, or maybe with like +2 speed or something. So I was actually considering picking him for that job, or maybe like just reclass the Wyvern and have him do it. I forgot the specifics, but the point was there was like one time in my life where I considered using dice, and that was as close as I ever got to using dice. I don't think he's super great, but again, his HP and strength bases are sufficient to do something, and he's an axe rank, so he's kind of alright in the context of this new mystery. Alright, let's go back to Kaga and its mini sagas. So FE5 has two, I mean, it doesn't really have any Berserkers, no playable ones anyway, but it does have Marty and Dagdar, who are basically bandits, and I mean, they promote to warrior, or rather Marty promotes to warrior. Dagdar is a warrior at heart. So Marty, I'm not gonna like surprise you and put him in like A tier or anything. I do think he is trainable. It's like the best thing I can say about him. Like, sure, his bases are awful. He has like a lot of HP and then 10 base strength, which is decent in the context of Thracia, considering he joins in chapter 1. And then he has a lot of builds, so he can rescue drop people after they've captured something. He can drop them, take their items. That's pretty useful. And he can fight. One thing I like about Marty in FE5 in the context of training him that I noticed is if you want to level up Marty, it's gonna really suck when he misses, and he misses like half the time or so. Every time he attacks an enemy that's weakened and he misses, he just doesn't kill. If this was like GBA Fire Emblem, he would get 1 XP in those cases, and you'd be like, shit, I just missed out on 29. But at least in Thracia, you get chip XP for missing. Even if you don't do any damage, you just get chip XP. He'd still get 10, so you can still work his way up. And then the hard part for Marty is getting from level, I think, 1 or 2 to level 10, because if you can make it at level 10, Marty has a really good promotion waiting for him. He gets like 6 speed and 6 skill from that promotion alone, and I wouldn't say that makes him a super great unit. The bad thing about that is, of course, that not only does he have to be trained for that long, but he's also going to get a bunch of build level ups, because he has like 75% build or con in his growths. So he levels up to 20 build, and you can no longer rescue him. And even if you can rescue him before then, your mounted units is going to lose like half of their movement by rescuing him, because he's just so heavy. So getting Marty around in chapters can be a bit difficult. He kind of just has to walk everywhere on his own. But again, Marty's one of those meme-tastic units. Like, come on, a bandit with 50% strength growth and then like 10% speed growth or something. It's so stupid that it just loops backwards and becomes awesome. But the promotion is decent, and if he gets like 1 point of speed, then he should have like enough speed to double most of the generic enemies. So he's trainable, but the amount of effort you have to put into it is obviously awful. He doesn't have any good 2 range until he promotes, because hand axes are absolute garbage in Thracia. And even when he promotes, he's stuck with using like iron bows, which are still not that great. But I would trade Marty over Darrows any day. Like, I will die on this hill. I think Marty is much more satisfying and much easier to train than someone like Darrows in FE1 or FE11, just because Thracia feeding is just a lot easier. You also have scrolls if you really want to, put an effort in to make him good, and I can boost his speed growth to like 40%, which it's still horrible, especially considering it's with the city scroll, but it's still pretty good when all things are considered. And you can still make him fast if you really want to. So if you want to go slow and maybe him all the way up, there's, it's not that difficult, and there's some kind of reward for it because you get like a semi-competent unit. It's not great still. His accuracy will leave a lot to be desired, but it sort of works. Dagdar is really amazing. I'm just going to straight up just put him in S tier right here. I think might just be the best axe user in the series, besides someone like Har or FE9 Titania or something like that. FE10 Har, of course. But Dagdar is super, super, super good within the context of Thracia. I feel like I've kind of been underestimating just how good Dagdar is in the context of FE5 until I played FE5 with negative growths, where basically people with like semi-competent bases still got destroyed by leveling up overall, because not only do they not gain stats, they lose stats as they go up. But Dagdar was unreal good in that run. Now, in a normal context of FE5, other units will come closer to how good Dagdar is, and I have played plenty of FE5, so I do remember just how good Dagdar is, even in that context. But I was just amazed by how much I could rely on Dagdar to do all the dirty work for me. So Dagdar, he has awful growth, but his bases in Chapter 1 are just so ridiculous. People call him endgame ready. I think that's like slightly not representing it exactly as I would say it, but they are on a level where he could fight in endgame, yes. The problem with Dagdar is, of course, that when endgame comes around, his qualities kind of falter, whereas his drawbacks are really exploited by the enemies. But for the first like 9 chapters of the game or so, the first 9 chapters where Dagdar is available, the opposite is true. And Dagdar is insanely high HP, good enough defense to take a couple hits, access to the Brave Axe, ability to accost enemies and capture them. Haha, that's the same thing twice, but that costs his skill. All super helpful, being able to attack from range with like an iron bow if you want him to, getting a support point from Tanya. All that stuff is super helpful to just make Dagdar so powerful, ready to wall off weak characters whenever you want to, waste ballista ammo by proccing a cost on them. The problem for Dagdar really appears when the game becomes less about how good of a combat unit you are and more about how well can you handle fighting status staves. And the answer for Dagdar is not at all. His magic is awful. If an enemy attacks him at range and he procs a cost against him, which is 100% of the time true, he'll just get attacked twice and possibly without even countering. So something like a bolting bishop or a Jormungandr mage or a Fenrir mage, those kind of stuff, that really hurts Dagdar, I feel like. And sometimes you're just better off not bringing him at all. He can still be useful in these situations. You can still Brave Axe a Jormungandr Dark Mage and just kill him without taking a counter. That's still an option that's available for Dagdar if you have no one else to do it. And frequently I still deploy him for doing that kind of stuff when your team is like split up, for example, in a chapter like the Gonzalez chapter, the very last one where you recruit him. It's just so helpful to have Dagdar around and kill like a single Dark Mage somewhere. That can be helpful enough, and it's worth dealing with his drawbacks just to do that. But for the most part, Dagdar's not as strong as he would be in the early game. But in the early game, he's just so fantastic, there's no way he's coming out of S tier. It's like FE7 Marcus in that way. No matter how much he might fall off later on, he's still worth deploying almost every chapter of the way because he's just that good. And in that context, it doesn't matter how good his growths are. Dagdar is absolutely amazing. Now, so far we've mostly talked about, characters in games where axes have quite low accuracy, and Binding Blade is going to be the last one of those. So we're still suffering from pretty bad accuracy, but I think these Berserkers are overall pretty decent. Gonzalez is my favorite out of the bunch, just for like personal reasons. I think he's a tier up on most of the other ones. There's going to be a lot of them I think are going to end up in the C tier. But Gonzalez I think is worthy of a B tier, sort of. I would maybe sooner put him in C+. Over like a B. I think he's like a lower B. It's kind of hard to quantify exactly without like an A tier for reference here. But I think Gonzalez's combat stats make him stand out enough to put him here, because he has one thing that a lot of these other Berserkers don't have, and that's speed. Gonzalez has good base speed, and he has good speed growth as well. So he actually doubles people. And the great thing about doubling enemies is that even if you miss once, there's a chance you're going to hit again. At least you'll do some damage. You have a better chance to one-hit KO enemies even without a critical hit. And speaking of those, Gonzalez is also in a game where Berserkers get 30% crit rather than the 15 that, for example, Largo gets, and Darts and Hawkeye. And some of these don't get any credit at all. And Gonzalez is also in a game where you can just buy killer axes. I think you can buy them in chapter 11, only in A routes. Of course, the weird thing with Gonzalez is that he has a different base level depending on which route you go, which I think was a mistake by the developers, like just a typo somewhere. He's A routes. In A route, he's level 5, and in B route, he's level 11, or I think 12. Doesn't matter much. It doesn't change the point. The great thing about level 5, of course, is that you have more levels to grow him, so he gets like 6 free level ups compared to the other one, who might eventually level cap if you just level them all the way. So he has more options in that regard. Of course, the other good thing about being level 12 or level 11 is that you can promote instantly, and the Berserker promotion bonuses, just like they were for Marty, are really good for Gonzalez because he gains a ton of skill. And like I said, FE6 axes have absolute garbage accuracy, so getting just a big boost of skill, I think it's like 5 or 6 points, is massive. That's like, doesn't sound like much because skill generally just gets underrated a bit as a stat. But if you gain, like, let's say he gains 5 skill, that's 10 extra hit per hit, and with a 2 end system, that can often be as much as like 15 extra hit, effectively like 50% extra chance to hit per hit. And when Gonzalez attacks twice, or he attacks like multiple times over a chapter, that really adds up. It's like having charm on yourself, for example. It's super, super helpful for him. And Gonzalez, of course, he also has the trademark really high HP. The high speed helps him dodge, so his durability actually isn't bad. He can walk on peaks and oceans to gain a better terrain advantage or better positioning and stuff. There's a lot of spots where just Gonzalez on the peak is very helpful. I personally like Tripper at 21 for him. Getting on the peak and then fight all the wyverns there, and the enemies will have like 0 to 20% hit on him. And even if they do hit him once with like an axe reaver, he still has like 2/3 of his HP remaining. He is just that bulky. So I think Gonzalez's combat stands out a lot. The drawback of Gonzalez is because he's so big, you can't really carry him around very well. I think after motion, you basically can only carry him with, I don't even know, is there a unit that can carry him at that point? I think he might just be too heavy. I do remember, like, even unpromoted Cavaliers having trouble picking him up sometimes, but it depends on whether they're promoted and whether Gonzalez is promoted. If you're just playing at the Roy pace, you just move every unit roughly around Roy every turn, you don't really care about getting ahead and getting kills early, then Gonzalez is perfect for you. He will destroy everything. If you're trying to play a little bit faster, finish chapters faster before reinforcements appear maybe, then Gonzalez will be a bit of a drawback, but he can still stay back and fight like wyverns somewhere. So unless you're doing like an actual LTC playthrough, I think Gonzalez will be like a B tier kind of unit for you. Of course, the tier list is not really about unit recommendation, but more about, how well does this unit stack up overall. But I think some practical application of Gonzalez was nice to fit in there. I think Gonzalez is helpful for most people who play Binding Blade. Let me just put it that way. Now, Geese, I do really like the Berserker class, but I think Geese is a fair bit worse than Gonzalez at combat overall. I go back and forth on these two quite a bit. I think I've said the opposite before, where I think like Geese is a bit better than Gonzalez. The thing with Geese is he has more well-rounded stats, and that's like it used to be like a pitfall where people would use well-rounded as if it's like a good thing, but the problem with Geese is that he doesn't stand out in the important stats, and he's actually worse than Gonzalez in the important stats, which are strength and speed. Now, to compensate, he has slightly better skill, and I think he's slightly better, like maybe res or something, but the point is, he doesn't stand out enough in those stats to where it actually helps his performance, and I'd much rather have overkill strength and speed than having Geese's better balance of stats. And I think overall it makes Geese fall by the wayside a little bit. He does turn another base level where you can always promote him, but I think early promoted Geese just isn't that good at combat. He still has hit issues, like very severe hit issues that Gonzalez also has. Slightly more skill, but still doesn't work. He joins with a Brave Axe that I would never recommend using with him because his accuracy is going to go through the bottom. He'll be super slow with it because it weighs him down. So just take that Brave Axe and use it for like breaking a wall, and that's about it. Geese does have a base axe level that's pretty high. It's like B axes to use that Brave Axe, so that sort of helps. But really, the most important axe to use is the Killer Axe. And I mean, I think Gonzalez, even if he can't use it at base, he'll use it as soon as it's like relevant. I think Gonzalez might have D axes at some point. I'm not completely sure, but either way, Killer Axe is what's important, and they can both use it when it matters. I think Geese is definitely worse than Gonzalez. Now again, if you're playing fast and you're looking to set up like rescue chains and stuff, I can see Geese being better for you because he has lower constitution, so it's easier to get him around and maybe rescue drop him like somewhere where he's useful, like I don't know, on a peak or something, or further ahead. For those kind of strategies, someone like Geese or even Garrett can be more helpful, but I think overall, I think Geese belongs like here. He still has a lot of the perks of the Berserker class. I think Darrows is still better. I think he still has a lot of perks that the Berserker class just really makes him good. Like 30% crit and peak walking is still helpful. But I can't recommend him as much as I would recommend Gonzalez to people. And then there's Garrett. And Garrett is nice because you don't have to put any work in him. So if you want something like an early promoted Geese, or someone that's like kind of like Gonzalez but without the overkill combat, you just want like decent combat for almost no work at all, then Garrett is your man. Garrett is actually pretty decent. Again, a lot of HP, a lot of crit, and a lot of strength, and that's really all he offers. But sometimes that's all you need for what you need to do. So the fact that he just does all that for free, I mean, the only cost is deploying Liliana to get him, and that's really about it. And you just have someone with C rank axes, which is, it's really low for promoted at that point in the game, but it uses the Killer Axe, so what more do you want, right? So at that point, you just use a Killer Axe and just use a Killer Axe and start killing wyverns. That's really all Garrett needs to do. There's some chapters where you just deploy him and have him walk towards a village like 2 tiles at a time, and he'll get there eventually, and that's all you need him to do. I think I think I personally prefer him over Geese, which might sound like sacrilege to some people. I don't even know how the word is pronounced, but there you go. It might sound really terrible that I'm putting a unit with like better long-term prospects, like lower than Garrett. But I think Geese doesn't give you enough for training him that I'd rather just use Garrett for most playthroughs. But if you prefer having better combat units or better combat stats after a bunch of training, then Geese might be better for you. But I think in an objective tier list kind of setting, I think Garrett is overall more useful. I don't think Geese does enough in the couple chapters he's around before Garrett to compensate for Garrett being completely free. Okay, so that's the Binding Blade, and now something cool happens. They give Axes better hit. FE7 onwards, Axes have better hit, and so you can use them without completely failing at life. You still don't want to fight sword users. You still don't want to go up against enemies in terrain like forests or on mountains and stuff. But for the most part, you're gonna have decent-ish hit, whereas normally for these characters, the hits are kind of shaky. Of course, for the DS emblems, it's different. I'm just talking about the units that are in games that are before FE6 or before FE7. So Dart is in FE7, and the great thing about Dart is they gave him that Gonzalez level speed growth. The base isn't quite there, but it's good enough to where if he just procs speed like enough times, he will eventually double. They did something very unfortunate for Dart though, is they gave him his own promotion item, and normally that is kind of okay if you just get it early enough, but the Ocean Seal is like chapter 23, and most promotion items join later. Like most people are focused on the cost of the Ocean Seal, but I just want to talk for a brief moment like how annoying it is that you get it 23. You get a Night Crest before that, you get like 2 Hero Crests before that, you get like 2 Guiding Rings before that, you get an Orion's Bolt before that, and the Ocean Seal is hidden in the desert. And the cool thing about the Ocean Seal though is you get it for free. Like you just get a thief or use like the desert item trick, and you just grab it turn 1 and you got the Ocean Seal. Cool, that's great. So now you got, at least you got a promoted Dart for chapter 23. So if you've trained him, he's pretty good. And you know, that's fine, but I do think it's a little late. The cost of the Ocean Seal, it's kind of whatever, because you probably have plenty of gold in FE7 anyway, especially if you have the silver card or you plan out your finances well. You also get a ton of money within the desert chapter. You get like a white gem that you can sell, and then you get like a Guiding Ring you probably don't need, and like a light brand and a Hero Crest you probably don't need. So you can afford to use the Ocean Seal on Dart and not run out of money in a normal playthrough of FE7. I'm not talking ranked, I'm just talking like a normal playthrough. And that's all fine. But in some playthroughs, you don't have these things, like in my 0% growth run right now, you don't have the silver card because Matthew doesn't have enough speed to steal it without, well, he just doesn't have enough speed to steal it, period. And in that case, you might need the Ocean Seal to get you some money. Or maybe you're playing an Iron Man playthrough and you've lost some expensive items along the way, or you weren't able to get certain treasures. Maybe you missed chapter 19 or somehow. The point is, if you're low on money, then the Ocean Seal becomes really tempting to just sell for 25k, especially because Hawkeye joins and some people only want one of each class on their team. And in those cases, it's like, oh, goodbye Dart, you were fun to use, but I'm just not going to use you anymore, I'm just going to sell your promotion item, and that's that. Maybe you want the cash to recruit Farina in a couple of chapters, I don't know. The point is, there was no reason for them to make this promotion item that expensive, and it's really stupid. I appreciate them giving us extra money in that way, but I also just don't like how it kind of shafts Dart, especially for like ranked runs, or Iron Man playthroughs, or Shipment growth runs. It seems like it just gets shafted that way. Now that said, Dart is still kind of like having Gonzalez in FE7, but with better accuracy. Worse crits, because in FE7, Berserkers only have 50% crit bonus compared to 30%. But I do think Dart works out pretty well against FE7 enemies if you just train him and use him for a while. His accuracy will be a bit shaky, but better than Gonzalez's for sure. And I think he can work out in the end. But on the other hand, I think Dart is, compared to Gonzalez, he's up against better competition. FE7 units, I think, are just more competent than FE6 ones for the most part. And especially like Hawkeye, but even just like the regular units are just pretty goddamn powerful in FE7. And the enemies are weaker overall, so you also need that overkill combat that Dart provides. Like, if you compare Gonzalez's combat to a good FE6 unit, not like Milady or Percival, but like, I don't know, Alan or Lance or someone like, I don't know, who's even the next best units, like Deke or something. I think he stacks up pretty well with trained Gonzalez. But if you compare Dart to trained units in FE7, I don't think he stands out much at all. Like, even a trained Kent or Sane, I think, will overall have better performance than Dart over the course of the game. And like, if you compare it to Marcus, obviously he's gonna get like floundered. So I think Dart is still like upper C, but I would still put him like a tier below Gonzalez, comparatively speaking. You can argue otherwise, I'm sure. Like, you can argue that maybe Dart is a lower rank B and Gonzalez is lower rank B as well, maybe. But this is the way I see it. Now, Hawkeye, on the other hand, I think is a fabulous unit. I'm just going to put him in A tier right now, and that's not just because of the muscles, and not just because of the abs. Like, I think Hawkeye is legit one of the best units in this series. At least, like, one of the best free units in this series. Like, the amount of opportunity cost for Hawkeye, which is 0, just pales in comparison to how much he offers for a team, which is insane durability. Even, like, decent res when he has a pure water, he just, like, eats mages for breakfast, which is something that most Berserkers can't really say. Like, even if they have such a measure, something like that that's available, they still take damage from mages, but Hawkeye just doesn't care. He has insane strength, of course, like 50 base HP, which is an insane HP pool to have for any unit at base level. Massive strength, just super durable, tanky. Hard to carry around, of course, just like Gonzalez, so like you can't rescue him with anyone but like maybe like Florina unpromoted, so he has to kind of get around on his own, but that doesn't really hinder him all that much. It still makes him he still finds spaces to be useful like that. Even if he falls behind a bit in LTC playthroughs. He has access to the Brave Axe, which you just get last chapter, so even if he doesn't double a certain enemy, you can still dispose him if you want to. And unlike in like FE6, for example, the Brave Axe is actually good in this game. It has decent hit. Hawkeye just has a way to dispose of enemies all the time. I guess what also helps a bit in FE7 is that axes get like a 5% extra hit when a unit reaches S rank, and Hawkeye reaches that very easily because he joins with base A rank axes. Another funny thing I forgot to mention about Garrett, for example, is he joined with like C rank axes chapter 15, so even getting to Armats for him is actually kind of difficult. I think Gonzalez and Geese reach it no problem though, but they don't get the hit bonus that Hawkeye and Dart get, for example. That's what I was getting at. So yeah, Hawkeye, pretty good. The Killer Axe gives him a lot of crit at base level. I think like 50 crit on most enemies. So even if he's not, like, let's say he fights like 4 enemies, he's probably going to crit at least 1 or 2 of them on enemy phase, and in that way it's kind of like he doubles half of them. So he has a lot of ways to compensate for his mediocre speed. He has like the same speed as Marcus, who at this point in the game generally doesn't double most enemies, but does enough damage to where he's still worth deploying. And Hawkeye is like that, but a bit better. So yeah, I really enjoy using Hawkeye. It's super, super powerful. Definitely carrying my 0% growth Iron Man right now. I hope that doesn't age poorly. Okay, Dazla. Like, after Hawkeye, you'd have really high expectations of a Berserker in FE8, but they just found a need to nerf him in every way. I think they did that with a lot of units in FE7 and FE8. It's like they took Pence from FE7 and they just made him worse in every stat, and then made Saleh in FE8. And they kind of did the same thing with Dazla. The main complaint I have with Dazla is his speed is just awful. He's like 8 base speed. Compared to Hawkeye's 11, that's a big drop in speed. FE8 enemies are about as strong as FE7s, I would say, maybe slightly bit weaker, but it's not a 3 speed difference there. So Dazla is actually like really struggling to double. Even on normal mode, even on draft races, we found that Dazla has a lot of like trouble just doubling enemies. Even Steel Lance enemies sometimes they just don't get doubled. If it's not like a Steel Lance Pegasus Knight, he's probably not doubling. That's unfortunate. His other stats are quite a bit worse too, so he has like a bit of hit issues. Sometimes he has bulk issues, but the speed one is the main one. Of course, he's still for free, like I still pre-promote, and he actually has a decent 40% speed growth, so if you get some level ups, he can maybe kind of go doubling. But the unfortunate thing about that is that Dazla is promoted, so he doesn't gain levels all that fast. So, especially in hard mode, it's just not going to work. So, is Dazla worth deploying? I mean, if you're not training anyone in FE8, if you're just rushing through with like Seth, and you just haven't trained someone like Franz or Vanessa or, I don't know, Garcia or Ross, then I can see Dazla being like one of your top 10 units, because FE8 doesn't really have that many good pre-promotes, so there's probably a spot for him where he can be useful. And if you haven't trained anyone like that, then he can definitely help out by like using Hammer on a Knight or countering a mage with the hatchet or something like that. Those are like, there's always something that Dazla can do if you want to. On the other hand, if you have a trained team with like 8 units, then Dazla will probably not add very much. Like, even if you have room to deploy him, there's probably you just don't want him to get in the way. You just don't want him, like, if you can have an enemy either fight Franz and get one-rounded, or they fight Dazla and they don't, why would you have Dazla take on that enemy? Why would you have Dazla do anything on enemy phase in that kind of context, right? So I think in that sense, Dazla's not very good. The water walking, I think it's also more limited in FE8 compared to what we could do with it in FE7 and FE6. There's not much of a point in peak or water walking in FE8. So overall, I would probably put him like around here somewhere. I could see him being more useful than Geese. I think Garrett, even though he has the axe issues, like all the accuracy issues that FE6 provides, I think he's still overall a bit more useful than Dazla is. Just like because FE6 is just quite a few chapters where it's just, okay, wyverns are coming at me. Let me just distract them with Garrett real quick. Whereas Dazla, the only chapter I can think of where Dazla is super helpful to have like that is the desert chapter where you can just kill Pegasus Knights that are coming from behind Erica. That's the only one I can think of, the desert chapter. Other than that, I wouldn't really use Dazla very much in FE8. We get to Largo from FE9. This is one unit I don't have much experience with because late game FE9 is a place I've rarely reached, but I've used him like once probably, and I've seen him used a couple times before. Largo is pretty fast. I think his stats are mostly focused on offense and on HP. One thing I've noticed with Largo, for example, when I've tried to use him in like his joining chapters, is he will have like 50 HP at the start of enemy or start of player phase, and get hit like 2 times, and he's down to like 10 HP, and it's like, oh shit, I better heal him. Because he would just die next turn if I didn't, and that's pretty typical. Like it sounds pretty typical for Berserkers in general, but I find that they usually have a bit more bulk than it or a bit more dodge, and Largo just feels a lot more fragile in comparison. It might also be because he hasn't built up any supports, whereas most FE9 units at the point have built up supports, so they dodge more, especially someone like Kira and Oscar Ike with the earth supports that they can get. So that's a big difference for him. I do think he can be useful just for routing a chapter. I think his joining chapter is the mountain one. Either joins in that chapter or the one before. I know it's the first chapter where you have Joffrey available, and the chapter is a kind of a tricky route chapter because enemies are all over the place. So having an extra person who can walk up the mountains with more movement than your paladins can be kind of helpful. After that, I don't really find a whole lot of uses for Largo. I do notice like offense is pretty good, especially with bonus experience in, because his growths are also very focused on strength and speed. So there might be a place for him to kill a bunch of enemies, but of course he has to be able to do that safely. And with Largo, I never get the impression that he's very safe to do that. I still think he belongs like roughly somewhere in the C tier, but in the context of FE9, where there are so many better units built up over the course of the game, and where the need for high-ranking offense is just not as good, I'm having trouble putting him like higher than this. I don't even know for sure if he's better than Dice or Geese for that matter, so I'm just going to put him in between. I don't think he's that great. There's probably a place for him, and more people more familiar with like Path of Rains might be able to place him more accurately, but this is where I would put him personally. I don't think he's as bad as Marty and Darrows and friends, but I think he does alright. Then there's the Last Promise. There are a couple of Berserkers there. I mean, Mark is a pirate. I think he's one of the worst units in the context of the Last Promise. I never had the honor of training him because he never really tempted me to. I think he joins in like effectively chapter 17, I want to say. It's like the equivalent of the Raven chapter in FE7 vanilla. It's even a very similar looking chapter with like a castle with winding hallways, and it's like the point where you start getting all the units from Siegfried mode back, and those are units that you've been training for quite a while, in addition to whoever you've been training in the main campaign. And in comparison, Mark just pales. There's nothing that he really offers. Last Promise doesn't have many good axe users, so if you really wanted to use one, I guess you could suffice. Like even Liquid, whom we'll discuss in a bit, isn't that great, and you get like Gary much later on. I can't really think of much else. So I would put him like, maybe he's better than Marty or Darrows. I honestly kind of doubt it. I'll put him like around here, I think. I think he's better than FE1 Darrows. That I know for sure. I think he might be worse than FE11 Darrows though. Honestly speaking, like just relatively, because the Last Promise has a lot of good units. Like every unit has the same growth total, I believe, or at least they have like competent strength and speed, with some exceptions. So Mark really doesn't stand out in any way, shape, or form. Now Liquid, he joins a fair bit later. It's actually possible to miss him, I believe, if you finish his joining chapter early, kind of like Erica about Cormac in FE8, where if you just clear the chapter early, it's like a kill boss chapter 2, I believe. You just don't get him. I think you have to wait until like turn 6 or 7 for him to show up, along with Haas, Storm, and Archer, I believe. Now, I don't remember Liquid being absolutely terrible, but I do remember he doesn't double everything at base, like not even close. He does have that crit bonus. He actually has Assassinate, like the Silencer Oko ability that assassins have. It's completely useless when it comes to combat, I believe, because, I mean, if you crit someone, they're probably dead anyway. But it does double XP gain, so that might be helpful on some occasions to raise him more quickly, because I feel like he's very similar to Largo in that way, where he's just entirely focused on strength and speed in his growths, and if you can get him to double and kill things, then at least he can be a useful player face assassin, and his hit is good enough to where he can get away with it. But the Last Promise, I never felt like really warranted the unit that like joined that late and needed those like really good combat stats. You have enough luck you have like enough player phase offense to get away without using liquid like that. I don't think you need to train a unit like that. You never, I mean, FE in general is never really a case of need, but I don't think he's worth the struggle compared to just investing in your main units instead. So I don't think he's that great, but I do think he might be worth a slot every now and then. So I'm going to put him like a little around Dice and maybe around Largo. I think he might be slightly better than Geese too. But that's like stretching it. I think this is about as good as it gets for Largo or for Liquid, because he's like still a unit you got to invest in. So that puts him like around the same level as like Geese, for example. I think this is roughly where I would put him. Alright, so there you have it. That's how I'd rank all the Berserkers. I made a ranking beforehand, so I knew they would roughly all end up in the C tier, and I think this is about accurate. It's also the section that's like the hardest to rate in general, because I mean everyone is going to agree that Hawkeye and Dagdar are super good, and most people will agree that Marty and Darrows are not very good, but everything that's in between is always tricky to rate. But I think this is roughly where I would put everyone. Don't put too much stock in it though, it's just a tier list I'm making for fun. I hope you enjoyed watching and listening, and I hope to see you next time. Let me know what archetypes I haven't done yet. I've been going through them one by one, figuring out things. I know there's one in particular that I want to do later on, the Lord rankings, which I'm really looking forward to. I want to save that one for last though, so I'm going to exhaust every single other option I can think of until then. Let me know what you'd like to see. Thanks for watching and listening, and I'll see you around. Peace.